we'll get started. Yeah. Please excuse our percolating coffee maker in the back. If we want coffee, we have to suffer through it a little bit. So good afternoon. My name is Sarah Ripp. I'm the Outreach Coordinator and Undergrad Advisor for the Latin American, Caribbean, and Iberian Studies program. I want to make a couple quick announcements for those of you who haven't come to our lectures before. We do have coffee and tea and some snacks in the back, as well as in the corner there's some information about flyers for some other upcoming lectures we have, an updated handout on our lunchtime lecture series, which we're at right now with the remainder of the semester, what we have upcoming. There's a sign-in sheet for our listserv if you want to be added to that. And there are copies of Hilary, our speaker's book, but they are for sale. They're not free, so mention that. I'm just going to read a little, the bio off the back of Hilary's book. So.
But they're priceless.
They are priceless. So Hilary Klein lived in Chiapas, Mexico for several years, where she worked with women's projects in Zapatista communities. After she edited a book of Zapatista women's testimonies to be circulated in their own villages, women in the Zapatista leadership suggested that Klein compile a similar book for an outside audience. She has been engaged in social justice and community organizing for 20 years. She currently works at Make the Road New York, a membership organization that builds the power of immigrant and working class communities. We are very pleased to have you here today, so thanks for coming.
Thank you so much. So, thank you so much, Sarah, for the introduction and for hosting me. It's really lovely to be here, and thank you all for coming. So since it's not a huge group, I actually was wondering if maybe we could go around quickly and introduce ourselves. If people just want to say their name, what their connection to the university is, if you're a student or a faculty or a visitor. And if there's one quick thing you either that brought you here today or that you were kind of a question that you had, nothing long, just to get a sort of sense of what people are kind of thinking and what people already are kind of know about. So maybe we start over here and go around.
Alberto Vargas, I'm the Associate Director of the LASIS, Latin American Studies Program. Well, I've been very interested in this topic from day one. I was in Quintana Roo in January 1st.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so something that has been much in my mind.
Great, thank you.
Francisco Scarano, Director of LASIS and historian, but of the Caribbean. Of course, interested in Zapatista and rebellion in general.
Thank you.
Darcy Little, Grant Coordinator of Latin American Studies.
And I'm Angela Buongiorno, the Financial Specialist for LASIS.
Great.
My name is Matilda Dos Santos. I'm a master's student in a program here at LASIS, and I'm generally interested in women's role in social movement in Latin America.
Great. Should we go back here and then around?
Sure. My name is Becky Smith, and I'm an advisor in the School of Education. And I just have a general interest in the topic and just love they've done so many great lectures.
Uh-huh.
I can't get enough. So.
Great.
My name is Kimberly Wild. I'm a graduate student in International Public Affairs. I actually spent a semester in Mexico when I was doing my undergrad degree, and I had the chance to spend like a week in Chiapas and learn a little bit about this movement. So just curious to learn more about it and do research.
Okay, great. Thanks.
So I'm Sarah Rick from as well. I'm here because we coordinated the lecture, but also I studied abroad in Mexico during undergrad. So it was many years ago, but I've always wanted to learn more about this topic. So I'm excited to hear your talk today.
Great, thank you.
I'm Josh Schwartz, and I'm an undergraduate student, and also a LASIS intern.
Great.
I'm Stefan Asnrath, the Papua AOS. I came here half a century ago from El Salvador.
Welcome. 50 years ago.
Yes, absolutely.
Ed Poe, yeah, I'm an alumni, but I'm also currently taking a course in global language issues. But I always come on to these things, and it has to be a very bad lecture for me not to show up.
Okay, so I'll take this is not a very bad lecture. I'm very flattered. So great, thank you everybody. As Sarah mentioned, I spent several years in Chiapas, Mexico, so from about 1997 to 2003. And It sounds like this group is fairly familiar with the Zapatista movement. Is there anyone here who would say that they are not familiar with the Zapatista movement? Okay, so just
Well,
to,
you cannot be yes and you cannot be no. It's always a sort of thing.
Sure,
That's why
yes,
we came here, because
yes.
we want to learn something.
yes, definitely. Just getting a general sense. So my time was spent there working with women's cooperatives primarily. When I was 19 or 20 when the Zapatista uprising happened in 1994, and it was a time when, for folks who are sort of my age or older, you might kind of remember this or have your own associations with that time period. It was kind of at the tail end of the Cold War, and the Berlin Wall came down in 1989, and there was this kind of sense of, what were popular movements going to look like, what were kind of the next wave of social movements going to look like, and there was the right wing kind of proclaiming the end of history and capitalism and the free market has won, and that's clearly not true, but it was just it was sort of unclear, necessarily how things would kind of shake out. So I think the Zapatista uprising came along at a time that was really interesting in that sense of this kind of presenting one alternative or one option of what social movements kind of could look like in that sort of post-Cold War time period. Are there, as you said, I don't, it's obviously people are somewhere in the middle, but could people just throw out, like, what are your general associations with the Zapatista movement? So we just, like I said, it sounds like people here are somewhat familiar, but so we kind of have some shared, this is kind of what the Zapatista movement is background. What do people generally associate with the EZLN or the Zapatista movement?
Well, I can say, perhaps aided by a number of students, graduate students we've had from Mexico, that it's actually the most recent, well, not the most recent, but the largest of the recent insurrections that indicate the profound instability of Mexican society and particularly its political regime.
Yes, absolutely. So this is the first slide I have here is, so people know the Zapatista movement is located in Mexico, and this is the state of Chiapas. So, I think as you're kind of referring to, the state of Chiapas is both very high concentration of indigenous people, but also very high concentration of poverty, marginalization, and ironically, sort of center of Mexico, like there's a lot of natural resources in Chiapas that end up getting kind of sent up to central and northern Mexico. There's a lot of hydroelectricity, for example, that gets sent up to central northern Mexico, even as those rural villages don't have electricity or running water themselves. So it's a beautiful state, but it is, there are a lot of those contradictions. So, and I think something else you kind of hinted at, there was, the Zapatistas very much come out of a legacy of indigenous resistance. So there's, been 500 plus years of indigenous resistance. They also really come out of the Mexican Revolution, the legacy of the Mexican Revolution. In 1910, so the Zapatista, the word Zapatista, of course, comes from Emiliano Zapata, who was a hero of the Mexican Revolution, and his banner was land and freedom. So they sort of took that up, but then, expanded it to many other demands. So speaking of which, what do people associate the Zapatista movement kind of fighting for? Absolutely. So land rights, indigenous rights. So I think on the one hand, they represent a very specific kind of context of rural indigenous villages in Chiapas, and at the same time, put out these kind of very broad universal demands that people around the world could really relate to. So justice, freedom, democracy, housing, education for all, land rights. So, I think it was, like I said, very specific to Chiapas and at the same time, very kind of universal. So this is Chiapas, and this is kind of the official map. So you see, the capital and then the different kind of regions. Many of those specific towns were taken over in the 1994 uprising. So, San Cristobal de las Casas was the most kind of well-known uprising. but this uprising was very brief. So 1994, it lasted really just about a week. In many places, it wasn't even violent. In Ocosingo, it was. So in Ocosingo's up here, there was actual combat. But the uprising very quickly turned into, so the EZLN continues to have, on the one hand, a revolutionary army, which still exists, although they haven't used their weapons since 1994. And on the other hand, it's a broad kind of social movement that is, uses political strategy, peaceful mobilizations, dialogue with civil society. Is that your hand up? You have a comment or a question?
Just a question on that. But the southernmost edge of the point, that's where the railway comes in from Guatemala and then sort of through and gets to the other side of the ocean, ocean, isn't it?
Yeah. So right, as you mentioned, so Guatemala's here, so it's the southernmost state, and so people and goods are traveling up sort of through Central America into Mexico and sometimes up to the U.S.
Does that still function, that railway?
I'm sorry?
Is that railway still?
I don't know, honestly, I'm sorry. So then this is actually the same map, but with kind of Zapatista territory. So as they carried out the uprising, they also took over land in a lot of this region. So this kind of shaded area is what's considered Zapatista territory. And as you mentioned, it being a struggle for land, land has historically been concentrated in the hands of very few people in Chiapas, ever since colonialism. With the Mexican Revolution and the land reform that came after that, there was some land reform, but historically less than in other parts of Mexico. So there were still, there weren't the same kind of huge plantations, they're called fincas in Chiapas, but there was still land concentrated in the same kind of few wealthy families that were historically descended from the Spanish, from the kind of colonial elite. And so in a lot of this area, especially kind of here around these canyons, they took over pretty vast pieces of land and redistributed it to indigenous families who historically had owned that land. And then indigenous peasants had worked on these fincas pretty much as indentured servants for centuries. So the reason the line is kind of jagged is that it's not kind of rebel-held territory in the traditional sense of here's kind of the line and everyone inside this line, is one thing and everyone outside is. There's sort of Zapatistas and non-Zapatistas living side by side in this territory. I'll talk about this in a little bit, but the Zapatistas have a whole kind of developed alternative, almost like a state system, but the Mexican state also does exist in this area. They sort of coexist. So that sort of jagged edge indicates that, like, it's considered Zapatista territory, but not in that kind of traditional, like, rebel-held sense. Does that make sense? And I think it's important to understand some of the conditions that were, probably this is familiar to some of you, either from this context or from other contexts in Latin America that were similar, that, both the level of poverty, the level of marginalization, like I said, the sort of history of indigenous people still, up until 1994, many of them still working on these fincas. And women in particular faced a very intense level of marginalization. So on top of, one of the Zapatista women leaders once said, Zapatista women are oppressed 3 times over because we're indigenous, because we're poor, and because we're women. So they were kind of facing all of those types of discrimination. And so women in particular couldn't really leave their homes without permission from their husband or their fathers. They were married oftentimes very young, against their will, had 10, 12, sometimes 15 children because they had very limited access to birth control. And because they were so confined to the private sphere, all the sort of realm of decision-making, public affairs, was very dominated by men. So there was this very kind of extreme sense of, women in the home and, men in the sphere of decision-making. So even though indigenous men were also very much impacted by, the race and the economic subjugation within the villages, they still were kind of more the ones, kind of running things. So that's just kind of background. A couple other things really quick. Do people know why the Zapatistas chose January 1st, 1994 as the day of their uprising? You're nodding your head. Yes. Would you like to share with us?
I think NAFTA went into effect.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Everyone knows what NAFTA is? Yeah? So the North American Free Trade Agreement went into effect that day. And so this is an example of how, on the one hand, the EZLN, and the EZLN stands for the Zapatista Army of National Liberation. In Spanish, it's the Ejército Zapatista de Liberación Nacional. So when I say the EZLN, the Zapatista movement, kind of interchangeable. But so they, you know, like I said, were coming out of this long history of indigenous resistance, and at the same time recognized kind of neoliberalism as the current state of global capitalism that was just going to be devastating for indigenous communities. And they were right. You know, many of us have seen since then, you know, the impact on rural Mexico that NAFTA has had. So they identified neoliberalism and the free trade in particular as going to be like a death sentence almost for indigenous people. And that's kind of connected to the EZLN. Like I mentioned, they continue to have a rebel army, but since 1994 have been known much more for this kind of broad social movement. Their marches, their political mobilizations. They negotiated a peace treaty with the Mexican government that was specifically about indigenous rights and culture, which was signed but never implemented by the Mexican government. And also this dialogue with civil society. So they've hosted a lot of encuentros, these kind of gatherings or events in their territory where people come from around Mexico and around the world to share ideas, share strategies, and help kind of build networks. And so they haven't been the kind of revolutionary movement that took over state power and kind of caused transformation that way, but I think they've had a really tremendous ripple effect in terms of the change that they've helped to create, certainly in their own region, but also throughout Mexico, and really kind of inspiring people around the world. And in particular, going back to neoliberalism, I think they very much helped plant the seeds of the kind of anti-globalization movement in the late 90s. A lot of the sort of mobilizations and protests that came out, you know, the movement against the protests in Seattle, all that kind of stuff, many of them point back to some of those gatherings held by the Zapatistas where they really identified neoliberalism as kind of the source of the problem in a lot of ways. So that's all sort of background. Is there anything anyone wanted to add that they kind of just feel like is important about the Zapatista movement? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't think it was so much about free trade. It was about, within that agreement, the big American companies were sort of like authorized to come in and take over large areas of land so that they could produce products. And that went directly in contra to the government agreement with the Indians that they would be able to have their land. So it was like the straw that broke the camel's back.
Yeah. In 1992, in fact, I'm not sure if you're specifically referring to this, but in 1992, Carlos Salinas, who was president of Mexico at the time, changed the Mexican Constitution to allow the ejido system, which was the kind of collective land system that came out of the Mexican Revolution. Historically has deeper roots, but kind of in that manifestation came out of the Mexican Revolution. Changed that so that those parcels of land could be bought and sold. And the ejido system historically had been this way to kind of protect collective land rights. And so I think that was like the Zapatistas very much identified this was, you know, an example of where the Mexican state was headed. So turning a little bit more to the subject of my book and the time that I spent down there, and then we'll come back again to some of one of the themes I wanted to share was kind of the Zapatista movement as an alternative to global capitalism, so we'll come back to that in a minute. But so, you know, like I mentioned, I spent about 6 years there. I worked mostly with women's cooperatives. I went down there originally for 6 weeks and ended up staying for 6 years. So you can see it was a very compelling time. And it was, you know, I think for me partially, someone mentioned, you know, they've always been interested in the relationship between women and social movements. And that was kind of what I really saw unfolding in that moment. I had actually done my undergraduate senior thesis on the women's movement that came out of the Sandinista revolution, sort of after the Sandinistas lost.
New York, a membership organization that builds the power of immigrant and working class communities. We are very pleased to have you here today, so thanks for coming.
Thank you so much.
Welcome.
So, thank you so much, Sarah, for the introduction and for hosting me. It's really lovely to be here, and thank you all for coming. So since it's not a huge group, I actually was wondering if maybe we could go around quickly and introduce ourselves. If people just want to say their name.
We'll get started, yeah. Please excuse our percolating coffee maker in the back. If we want coffee, we have to suffer through it a little bit. So good afternoon. My name is Sarah Ripp. I'm the Outreach Coordinator and Undergrad Advisor for the Latin American, Caribbean, and Iberian Studies program. I want to make a couple quick announcements for those of you who haven't come to our lectures before. We do have coffee and tea and some snacks in the back, as well as in the corner there's some information about flyers for some other upcoming lectures we have, an updated handout on our lunchtime lecture series, which we're at right now with the remainder of the semester, what we have upcoming. There's a sign-in sheet for our listserv if you want to be added to that. And there are copies of Hilary, our speaker's book, but they are for sale. They're not free, so mention that. I'm just going to read a little, the bio off the back of Hilary's book. So.
But they're priceless.
They are priceless. So Hilary Klein lived in Chiapas, Mexico for several years, where she worked with women's projects in Zapatista communities. After she edited a book of Zapatista women's testimonies to be circulated in their own villages, women in the Zapatista leadership suggested that Klein compile a similar book for an outside audience. She has been engaged in social justice and community organizing for 20 years. She currently works at Make the Road New York.
You know, what their connection to the university is, if you're, you know, a student or a faculty or a visitor. And if there's one quick thing you either that brought you here today or that you were kind of a question that you had, nothing long, just to get a sort of sense of what people are kind of thinking and what people already are kind of know about. So maybe we start over here and go around.
Alberto Vargas, I'm the Associate Director of